very nervous, but my English is not good, so I'm sorry for you for the next 20 minutes. Next. My name is David Prieto. I am biologist. I'm full professor in the faculty in Iztacala in the National University of Mexico. My laboratory is named Biodiversity and Climate Global Change. Is focused to general information or investigation, mainly associated to research lines in ecology, biogeography, and conservation of biodiversity in the neotropics. In this sense, my research lines are associated to analyze the impacts of global change, the ecology of vertebrate, landscape connectivity, biogeography of tropical forest, and systematic conservation planning. However, all these research is not only performed for me. It's a pleasure to me to say that I have several, maybe a lot of students that are very interested and compromised to study the biodiversity pattern in these regions. Especially considering the human impacts, human activity impacts in the biodiversity. In the last 3 years, we are focused to analyze the biodiversity pattern in the Mesoamerican regions. That is distributed from northwest Mexico to south Panama. This site is very important because it's considered an important biodiversity hotspot site in the world. Only for the vertebrate case, in this part of the planet, we can find maybe 15% of all species described for these 4 main vertebrate groups. In these areas, we can find also at least 5 different biomes and several ecoregions that promote a high concentration of species in the area and high endemism of species. However, these biomes are very different in climatic and nature conditions across the landscape, and also are different impacts of human activities in these territories. In addition, there are several problems in the conservation for this biota. There are recent evidence suggests the conservation gap in the Mesoamerican region is very high, mainly associated to protect areas in the Mesoamerica has been identified or delimited based on criteria that are not scientific. This represents a big problem because today is well known that several Latin American countries in the region has not sufficient protected area in quantities, but also the representative biota within us is not adequate. But the main problem is that these protected areas are not be effective to protect the biota under climate change scenarios. So more studies and conservation planning are very need to address this problem. However, from my perspective, this conservation planning to future requests that we discuss about 3 main questions. That is, what, where, and how to promote the conservation in the biodiversity in the area. This is important to be discussed because even between ecologists, biologists, and conservationists, the interest and perspective could be very different. So in the next presentation, I would like to show you some examples from results obtained in the project in my lab that showed how important is discuss about this question in the plan for future. In the first example, I would like to show you the species diversity pattern for the avifauna in the neotropical seasonal dry forest. If we project these patterns to future climate scenarios, the model suggests that more than 75% of species could reduce their distribution area in the future. This is very important because we observe three main patterns. The first one is that the projected impact by climate change is not uniform across the geography, but also among species. In fact, the unique general pattern observed among species is that the negative impact spectrum is the same among or for both endangered or non-endangered species in the regions. This is a huge problem because it's necessary to discuss what should be protected, endangered or non-endangered species, vulnerable or not, or tolerant species to climate change, or even is the current areas with high concentration of species will be protected in the future. However, this picture could be more complicated because if we compare the taxonomy, phylogenetic, and functional biodiversity pattern for this avifauna, we can observe that the patterns are different between them for the same species. Only that community shows different values for species number, evolutionary history, or ecological traits between communities. So I would like to ask, what protects? Species number, evolutionary history, or ecological traits to species or ecosystems. However, this picture could be more complicated because it is well known that climate change in biotic interaction could be so or more important than environmental change. In this work performed by Daniela Remolina, we estimate the pattern for co-distributions between hummingbird and plants in Mexico. The model under global climate change scenario shows that both birds and plants will face important race disruptions in the future. This promotes that spatial congruence for the co-distribution among taxa will be reduced in the future, and so the interaction is broken. So change could be to lead the formation of novel ensembles with a clear tendency to specializations in the network between plants and animals. So if we want to protect important ecological service house pollination, so our analysis must be considered the co-occurrence pattern between species. Another important question in this point in the long-term conservation is where the conservation effort must be focused. For the same case of neotropical dry forest and its avifauna, we observed that in the current scenario, the protected area covers only a low proportion of the ecosystem. This proportion of protected area only represents the 10% of the distribution of species. In fact, more than half of the species show less than 10% of the distribution within these conservation areas. In this sense, is we combine this information by biodiversity and information across the landscape in the Mesoamerica region we can't use the systematic conservation planning approach for define this priority conservation area to protect the unique biodiversity in this forest. In fact, by considering our prioritization or results, the protection in this group will increase more than 2 times in the future. However, this result is only considering the current scenario. But it's important that this systematic conservation planning has been performed considering the global climate change and global land use change in the future, because several studies suggest that this both factor could promote an important reduction in the distribution for a species, maybe 17% of the original distribution in the present scenario. In fact, the existing protected area in the ecosystem only cover maybe 15 or 15% or remains range of species in the future. So we need to define new conservation area to protect this unique biodiversity. In this sense, we repeat our original work, but using the information for model projection in the future and define several sites in the map. It correspond to blue color that represent priority conservation areas that protect or help us to protect the biodiversity on both scenarios, present and future. This approach is commonly known or called dynamic or floating protected areas, because they are the limit based in the distribution pattern of species in the present and the future. It's important that in the case of Mesoamerica seasonal dry forest, observed that most part of this area were identified across the Mexico, specifically in the Pacific coast of Mexico. This is very interesting because in other studies, principal focuses in geography studies for birds in the ecosystems, identify these sites as center or diversification center or refuge areas for the biodiversity. In this sense, if we not protect this area, we call loss a unique information in species and genetic information in the world. So maybe the question is, refuge areas are the answer to the question where. It's not easy to define this, but this is the new proposal. Maybe will be interesting to ask what proportion of this area are protected right now. Finally, the more important part is how to conserve. And that is the more important question, because the truth is that only increase the surface of the area is not the answer for this situation. We need to promote the implementation of more complementary programs, including the restoration of vegetation, to ensure the long-term conservation. It's very important promote research to identify and promote the suitable use of nature in the local community. This scenario is possible? Yes. There are some examples in Costa Rica and even here in Mexico that show that is all part work together, is possible to promote a suitable use of the nature in the community or the society. However, it's important to to understand the environmental education tools is very important to increase the knowledge of all these patterns for the community society. So in the laboratory, the student is frequently participate in the diverse events, so to educate or learn about these result in our projects. So maybe the information is a lot, and maybe the word my students think that is enough, but not. In this year, we start to a new project in Mesoamerica region, but in this time it's not only for bees. Our main goal is repeat all these analyze in species, taxonomic information, phylogenetic information, and functional information, but also for other groups as frogs, reptiles, and mammals, but also for plants, because the plants is the main group we has a lot of information got, but at the same time is the more diverse group in the region with more than 2,000 species reported in Mesoamerica. Finally, I would like to say thank you for all national and international institutions that support our research, and especially to my students and partners that participate in this lot of projects. Thanks. I'm sorry for my English.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for that really compelling and interesting presentation. I found it particularly interesting how you highlighted the need to consider the functional diversity and interrelationships and bring that into systematic conservation planning. So thank you so much for sharing your research. There's been quite a few questions in the chat, and I'm sure that there's also some more questions amongst our group here on Zoom. So first, I'd like to invite anyone who may have a question to unmute if they feel comfortable to ask a question.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you. And also, or maybe to start us off, I might read some of the questions that have popped up in the chat. So one of the first questions that has come up is, as temperature and humidity patterns change, could neotropical birds face an increase in vector-borne diseases?
That is a point that is not evaluated in my lab, but another pattern is focused in this research, and it's very interesting because the evidence suggests that disease is increased with climate change.
Thank you. If anyone wants to put their hand up, otherwise I can read one of the other questions that has come up in the chat.
Hay aquí una en español.
So the next question is, can changes in flowering and fruiting patterns of plants due to climate change influence the availability of food for migratory birds, but I suppose migratory species?
Yes, it is possible. This scenario is, in fact, is an interesting question that the student, maybe Daniela Remolina, is very compromised to analyze this factor, but it's not easy because the information in environment variable is mainly found in average, annual average. But there is evidence about this phenomenon.
Great. Thank you. Scrolling through to see any hands up. Okay. We probably have time for one or two more questions, if there's one from the audience. Of course, as well, if you have a question but you don't want ask it here today, I'm sure it's fine to contact the organizers, and we can facilitate.
We have a question here.
Oh, great.
Thanks for the presentation, David. I'd like to ask, which are the challenges associated with the availability of the information regarding the geographic system, and particularly with the scale on the different areas that you're covering with this region? Because I'm guessing that probably the information from Mexico is really different in scale than is that from Costa Rica, for example.
The scale problem is not only for Mesoamerica region, it's even here in Mexico, because the unique topography and geography in the region promote several endemics or species. So each community has different species across the landscape. In the lab, our main research line is the macro scale approach. However, we need information from species distribution in the local scale. In this case, when we development projects in the local community, the student has the important task to promote the information, not only with the copy thesis, development environmental tasks for children and young or even people major. And in this last week, we designed the brief gift to the identification of mammals in the Tehuacán-Cuitatlan Reserve Biome. This activity is very important to promote the information within the community.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. If there are any more questions, I might ask the audience members to please just hold them for now, or contact the organizers so that we can exchange details later on, so that we can continue on with the schedule as planned. So before we do, can we please thank Dr. David again for this really, really interesting presentation. Thank you. And so our next speaker for today's session is Dr. John Dwyer from the University of Queensland, who will be sharing his insights on ecological restoration in Australia. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Courtney. I'll try and share my screen here. Hopefully you can now see that and hear me.
Yes.
Is that okay? And you can see that now in full screen glory? Okay, that's great. So thanks so much for inviting me to talk today, and thanks a lot to the organisers, especially Evelyn, who's been whipping me into shape and making sure I turn up. So it's a really nice opportunity to meet a new audience today, and I'm quite excited about it. What I'm going to provide is a very high-level overview of restoration in Australia, why we need it, how we go about it, and what we actually achieve or don't achieve. So before I get started, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that I'm presenting from today, the Yagara and Turrbal people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Okay, so I'll get straight into it. why we need terrestrial restoration in Australia. So I'm focusing here on terrestrial restoration, acknowledging that there are other realms in which we undertake restoration in Australia. What I'm not going to talk about today, because I simply don't have time, is why humans actually do restoration in Australia. What motivates us to do that? If you are interested in that, Valerie Hager wrote a lovely, lovely paper based on some great survey work that revealed people's motivations for doing restoration, which aren't always as rational as you'd think. Very fascinating work. So we need restoration in Australia. You probably already know this because we've cleared lots and lots of land. And the areas shown in white here are the areas that have been cleared or highly modified in Australia. And of course, these overlap with the areas of highest agricultural suitability. In these areas, we've seen dramatic reductions in the areas of habitat for the wildlife that occupy those habitats. And this is where we see a lot of our threatened species occurring. It's not a coincidence. Now, if we take those areas that have been cleared and we then sort of say, okay, well, what's been actually degraded in Australia? And some great work by Sutton back in 2016 identified over 52 million hectares of Australia could now be considered degraded. So that's quite alarming. And of course, this overlaps with the white area on the previous map. So we've reduced the area of habitat in those areas dramatically, and we've also degraded the land mainly through agricultural land uses, so that it's very difficult in some places to restore, to try and get some habitat back in the landscape. Okay. Now, if you know anything about restorations, the act of restoration and the science of restoration ecology, you see lots and lots of these sorts of diagrams. This is one that's been adopted from the Australian National Standards on Restoration. They always have axes that look like this, something like ecosystem condition from intact to degraded on the bottom here. And on the y-axis, we've got a functionality axis from fully functional to non-functional. And ideally, where we would like to be whenever we're undertaking restoration is up here, where in the top right, where really there's lots and lots of capacity in the landscape for passive recovery, natural regeneration, if you like. But as we make our way down this squiggly line, we might find ourselves down here in a place that's highly degraded and non-functional. And you might think of an area down here as being an open cut coal mine or something that's very, very, very modified and very, very difficult to try and restore. I'm going to provide a couple of examples of landscapes in Australia that occupy different parts of this condition functionality space. We're going to go to the Brigalow Belt, where I did my PhD many, many moons ago when I had less grey hair. And we're also going to go to the wheat belt of Western Australia, where I've spent quite a lot of time undertaking research as well. Now, Brigalow, as you can see from where I've positioned it on this diagram, has a greater capacity for natural regeneration compared with the wheat belt, which is, as you will see, very difficult to restore. This is where those two landscapes or bioregions occur in Australia. The Brigalow Belt is inland of Brisbane. This is where I'm presenting from today, over here in the east. And the wheat belt is all the way over on the other side of this very, very big country, down in the bottom in the southwest here, near the capital city of Perth, which is one of the most isolated capital cities in the world. Okay. So let's think about the Brigalow Belt. What is Brigalow? It's a funny word. Brigalow is what we use to describe this ecosystem and the tree. So the gentleman in the photo is my colleague, Rod Fensham, and that's a Brigalow tree that he's got his hand on. It's an Acacia harpophylla, and it forms these rather tall and impressive forests in relatively dry places. What you can't see in this photo is that there's not a lot of grass in this ecosystem, and that's problematic if you want to graze things, if you want to grow fat cows, for example. So what people realised is because these systems occur on fertile clay soils and the climate is amenable to growing grass, if we could somehow get the trees off this and replace it with grass, then we might get a good beef industry going. So after World War II, we had technology derived from war technology like tanks in the form of these dozers. So we worked out that we could drive 2 big dozers in parallel with giant chains. You can't really see the chain there, but there's one there, and we can just pull over hectares and hectares and hectares of woody vegetation very efficiently. And this was the fate of a lot of the brigalow after World War II. We call this pulling scrub, because you're just effectively pulling it over. So the result is that we've gone from this type of quite woody forested area, quite closed, low grass cover area, into this very, very grassy, open sort of landscape. The grass here that you can see is buffel grass from Africa. So we've replaced this ecosystem with effectively a grassland that is mostly comprising African grasses. This is problematic, especially for the brigalow fauna. The brigalow ecosystems support a fairly unique assemblage of herps, including this very, very cute golden-tailed gecko here. And other casualties of this very extensive land clearing include very cute mammals like the bridled nail-tail wallaby that was thought to be extinct and was only rediscovered, about 30 or 40, no, 40 years ago now. So there's been a lot of casualties, ecological casualties of the extensive land clearing. Just to show you what that looks like, I'm going to zoom into this part of the brigalow belt. Now, this dark green signature that you can see on the photo, that's brigalow. This is a part of the brigalow that I've done some research in. All of this light green is now grass. It used to be the very dark green brigalow forest, and it's now all grass, and mostly an African grass. All of this vegetation surrounding hasn't been left because we were great conservationists. It's been left because it's not suitable for agriculture. It's suitable for timber production, and we've extracted timber from it, but we haven't cleared it like we've cleared the brigalow. Just a little note too, the brigalow, especially the northern part of the brigalow region, there's a lot of coal mining activity as well. So it's not just habitat clearing for agriculture, but also for some fairly intensive mining activity in this part of the world as well. Now, excuse my attempts here at a drawing. I'm not very good. This is my attempt to show you what happens with brigalow when we try and clear it. So we have this is a brigalow tree. It's my attempt to draw a brigalow tree. And we come along and we pull over the scrub with the big dozers and chains that you saw. And then we'll probably take all of that timber and we'll put it in a pile, let it dry, and then we'll burn it. We don't use the timber, we burn it. It's crazy. Imagine how much carbon gets released when we do that. But we leave roots in the ground. And those roots are able to produce suckers from adventitious buds. And we end up with what we call regrowth, or passively recovering vegetation. So farmers don't like this regrowth. They would like it to stay grass, but this system just won't die. Brigalow just keeps coming back. So it does have this amazing capacity for regeneration. It doesn't regenerate all of the elements of the ecosystem equally well, but this brigalow tree in particular can come back quite well. So we might be able to foster this regrowth for free. We might not have to actually plant trees in lots of parts of the brigalow belt. Now let's compare that to the wheat belt in Western Australia, a very, very different scenario. So we're over in the western side here of Australia. Now, all of this light green that you can see here in this image is now wheat production, canola production, and sheep production. The wheat belt, it's called the wheat belt for a reason, okay? Now, the problem with that is that if I draw a line from this W in the wheat all the way down to over here near a little town called Esperance, in this bottom corner of West Australia, there are 3,000 endemic species of plant that occur nowhere else in the world. So just in this bottom corner here, 3,000 species of plant that occur nowhere else in the world. So that's problematic, okay? And this is a Mediterranean climate. So it produces very diverse Mediterranean climate flora. It's very, very famous. Now, this is just a few images to show you. It's a very typical sort of shrubby or temperate woodland sort of mosaic. This is from some of the shrublands. They're very diverse and very pretty. Lots of members of Proteaceae and lots of members of Myrtaceae and other groups as well that have just absolutely diversified in this part of Australia. I could show you an entire 20 minutes just of amazing photos of plants from Western Australia. It is breathtakingly beautiful and diverse. So if we zoom into one of these little areas of the wheat belt, just to show you the extent of clearing, I'm going to zoom into this little yellow rectangle here. We can see all of these tiny little rectangles are postcards of leftover shrublands or forests, or woodlands, I should say. There's no forest, it's all woodlands or shrublands in this very, very, very heavily modified landscape. All of the light colours you can see here indicate wheat and sheep production. And of course, this is drier over here. And so we get slightly more and slightly larger areas of bushland that have been left compared to this wetter area that has been more heavily cleared for agricultural production, which probably doesn't surprise you. So when we go and we start with so many endemic species, it's so diverse, and we do that to the landscape, we end up with a very impressive list of endangered species. This is the list of critically endangered species. I think it's since been added to. There's a long list of endangered as well, and other forms of threatened. Not only is this list kind of long, but these species are just so damn beautiful. They're so weird. We have an underground orchid. This orchid completes its entire life underground. It's unbelievable. So we had a lot to lose, and it looks like we're losing it in this part of the world. So it's a really interesting and different scenario to the brigalow. This is an example of the type of shrublands that you get. It's a Mediterranean climate, as I said. Now, these are ancient landscapes. These are very, very old soils, and they're very low in plant available phosphorus. So a lot of the plant species that have evolved here have got special characteristics that allow them to get phosphorus, tiny amounts of phosphorus from the soil. And there are many highly specialized interactions between plants and soil organisms to help plants get what they need in this landscape. So that's interesting, because so many of the species, especially the woody species that occur in this part of Western Australia, no longer have the ability to regulate phosphorus uptake. They have not needed to regulate that because they've had such little phosphorus. That hasn't been their problem. Okay, the problem has been getting phosphorus. Okay, so that might be a hint as to what's to come. So what we do is we clear these shrublands and woodlands, we plough them, and then we try and grow wheat. So the rainfall is good. It comes in winter and spring. It's great for wheat. The physical properties of the soil are great for wheat, but we need to add phosphorus. We need to add fertilizer to grow the wheat. Okay, so that's what we've done. We've cleared the vegetation and we've added the phosphorus. So now it's a very, very productive part of Australia in terms of wheat production. But of course, what we've done in that process is effectively scramble the egg of the ecosystem. We have completely disrupted all of those highly specialized interactions between plants and soil microorganisms. We've elevated the phosphorus and provided opportunities now for phosphorus to poison or kill plants because a lot of these species can no longer regulate phosphorus uptake. So they get too much of it now in these landscapes, which kills them. So sorry about this terrible photo, but it's actually quite accurate. What happens when we abandon agriculture in the wheat belt of Western Australia is not much. The land gets, I guess, colonised by grasses from the Mediterranean region, the eponymous Mediterranean region. This is an avena from Spain, and it stays there like that for decades and decades and decades. The woody vegetation in the background has maybe come up since clearing, but not much of it. So it just stays in this alternate state for decades and decades and decades. The levels of phosphorus stay very high for a long time as well. So this is a very different situation to the brigalow. Okay, so how we go about restoration in Australia. So we have national standards for the practice of ecological restoration, and these were released in 2016, so they're fairly recent. But you know, overlapping a little bit with what David was talking about in the previous talk, we understand the importance of trying to, I guess, recover different aspects of the ecosystems. Okay, it's not just about getting plants back in the ground like we used to think it was. Here we're trying to achieve a score of 5 in a whole bunch of different categories, including recruitment, gene flow, interactions between species, trophic interactions, and the like. So we've got a very comprehensive way of assessing the progress of restoration, and this has been a great advance. Okay, so how do we actually go about restoration? So it's not just the brigalow that has this capacity to sort of passively recover. A lot of open eucalypt forests can also do this. They do it mostly from seed rather than sprouting. And Don Butler and Paula Peters have generated some great guidelines on how you can manage your land to help this regrowth come back, and then how can you manage that regrowth to try and get to the middle of this diagram where we've got the structure that we want to provide the habitat for the species that need it in these very, very, very heavily cleared landscapes of Australia. So passive restoration is an option for some ecosystems. We spend a lot of money in Australia on weed control and weed removal. And given my audience today, I thought I'd throw in a little something from your part of the world that you've gifted us here in Australia. And of course, I'm not blaming anyone for that, but it's fascinating that we now struggle with weeds like cat's claw creeper in and around southeast Queensland, where I'm reporting from today. It's a really, really, really nasty weed. It smothers our riparian and sclerophyll forests. It kills large trees. It's a very impressive plant. So we spend lots and lots of money controlling weeds. We call them environmental weeds, including these vines. These vines, not just this species, but others, are very, very problematic, and we spend lots of money trying to remove them from our ecosystems. In terms of active restoration, if we want to turn, say, this pasture area here back into some sort of forested ecosystem that it once was, we spend a lot of time growing nursery-grown seedlings that we call tube stock. And we call it tube stock because of the size of the tube that they're grown in. So this is just an example of an experiment that I've been involved with about an hour west of the University of Queensland. So we spend thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars and many, many hours planting trees. Now, this happens a lot in mainly in the tropics and subtropics of Australia. Further south, there's a combination of planting seedlings, but also using direct seeding. So where we just put the seed in the ground and hope it will germinate. And we've modified lots of farm machinery for the purposes of restoration. You can see some examples here. So as I said, in the temperate regions of Australia, where there's a bit more of a reliable winter and spring rainfall, this direct seeding tends to be more commonly used. Now, what does it cost to undertake restoration in Australia? I've provided you with these amounts in Mexican pesos as well. So this is great work by Bonnie Mappin and my colleagues here at the University of Queensland. The paper's a lot more about, is about a lot more than just these costs, but this paper provided some nice estimates. So if we just look at what it costs to passively restore forests and woodlands in Australia, we're looking at about $1,400 a hectare. Compare that with trying to actively restore land, which is, of course, far more expensive. And the estimate here was 4 times more expensive between passive and active. And this does not include maintenance. So if you've ever been involved with restoration and you're trying to plant trees or direct seed, you need to maintain, you need to spend lots of time controlling grasses, replanting things that die, and watering, and it's very, 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 very expensive and time consuming. So what do we actually achieve with terrestrial restoration in Australia? And I'm going to try and be a little bit positive about this rather than super negative. So passive restoration in Australia, I'm going to talk a little bit about the brigalow again here, just to show you how much regrowth we get. So before we started clearing the brigalow, there was about 7.3 million hectares in Queensland alone. That's a lot. And there's now about 1.18 million hectares of brigalow vegetation. Now, that includes regrowth. And I guess the take home here is that there's over 720,000 hectares of passive brigalow regrowth in Queensland at the moment. Now, most of it is in the young form. It's quite young. It's under 15 years old. It doesn't look anything like a forest yet, but it's there. The sort of future trees are there, if you like. Now, most of this young stuff won't make it to being advanced or intermediate. It'll get cleared, but that's another story. Now, do animals use this regrowth? The short answer is yes. This is great work by Michaela Bowen a while back at UQ. And the title of this paper says it all. The age and amount of regrowth forest in fragmented brigalow landscapes are both important for woodland-dependent birds. So the amount of advanced regrowth and the size, the amount and age of the regrowth is important for birds. So birds do use it, and woodland-dependent birds do use it. So in terms of active restoration, this is the sad part. Nobody actually knows how much land has been actively restored in Australia. There's so many different people using so many different funding sources, so many different motivations and ways that people are doing restoration that we haven't really kept track of it. But we know the area is very, very small compared to what has been degraded. And sadly, probably because we haven't had enough time to assess this, but there are zero examples of complete active restoration of formerly cleared land. Okay, so we've been trying to undertake active restoration only for a few decades, and we just don't have enough time or don't have enough data yet to see whether we can actually achieve complete restoration. Our attempts to assess restoration and recovery are comparisons of plantings versus regrowth versus mature forests. This is work by Tim Staples that shows that regrowth gets us back to close to the original above ground biomass of a lot of these systems. But both plantings and regrowth are still a while off in terms of the species richness that we need and many other attributes of the forests. Plantings, as you can see here, only occupy from, say, 5 to 15 years along this age axis because we just haven't been doing it for that long. So we don't know what the longer term outcomes are. One big question mark for active restoration in Australia is, will we achieve recruitment, this is the part of the restoration wagon wheel that we are really worried about, or one of the parts of the wagon wheel. This is a really common scene in Australia where we've gone along and planted trees in rows. The trees are there, but you can see there is no recruitment. There's nothing coming up underneath. So when these trees die, does this just revert back to a grassland? Okay, so what do we achieve? It seems like we've achieved this sort of, at high expense, we achieve this temporary state of having trees there that might get used by some fauna, and then we go back to grass. It's a bit of a worry. And in terms of whether fauna actually use our attempts at active restoration, the evidence is yes, but not the same groups of fauna that use the mature forests. We seem to be making these forests for different suites of species. So my take-home point, sorry, Courtney, we've degraded a lot of Australia. Landscapes vary in their capacity to recover. Passive restoration is much cheaper and it's much more extensive. And areas like Western Australia are going to be very expensive and difficult to restore. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, John. The chat has been full of questions throughout this session, and actually there's been quite a few of them that I think are going to be relevant to our roundtable discussion that we have at the end of the session today. So I might shift a few of them towards the end there, because I think it's a great opportunity to discuss the challenges and similarities to restoration approaches in Australia and Mexico. Yep. So,
sure.
But in the meantime, I might just ask one quick question that's interesting that's come up in the chat, which is in your experience, how open have landholders been to conservation strategies?
It depends where you are. You know, around cities, there's a lot of people undertaking restoration. I'm in a bush care group in my suburb in Brisbane. Out in agricultural landscapes, the attitudes are very mixed. You know, it depends on people's motivations. In the wheat belt, a lot of people started planting trees on their properties, not because they were that concerned about habitat loss, but because there was a risk of salinity creeping into their property. So they were trying to plant trees. So the answer is very complicated, and it depends.
Thank you. If there are other questions for John or any of our speakers today, Evelyn will shortly also be sharing a contact details exchange sheet where you're welcome to put your email addresses and your contact details if you'd like to have further discussions with any of the speakers today. So before we move on, I'd like again to thank John for your presentation. Awesome. Okay, and our next speaker today is Dr. Tania Garrido from UNAM, who will be sharing her research on environmental connectivity through urbanized environments. Dr. Garrido's research focuses on questions in the fields of connectivity, genetic genome landscape, and conservation. In general, she uses terrestrial vertebrates, landscape ecology, GIS-based ecological modeling, and genome data to understand patterns of connectivity among populations of vertebrate species. She's particularly interested in the processes that maintain functional connectivity, the effect of environment and landscape in a changing world. She's also interested in local adaptation in urban and natural areas to understand the possible responses of species to climate change. So over to you, Tania. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for coming and thanks for the invitation to organizers. So I will talk about we are doing in our lab. The principal topic is about connectivity. And in this case, I would talk about environmental connectivity through urbanized environments, amphibians on Trans-Mexican volcanic belt as a case of the study. There are two things important that affect the biodiversity. One of these is the climate change. And the climate change in Mexico is not equal along of the Mexico. For example, the length of the warm season has increased from 1990 to 2020. The average annual temperature is spatial heterogeneous. This means that in the north of the Mexico, increasing more the temperatures in the south. And high maximum temperature has almost doubled from around 1990 to the present. Greater frequencies of days with extreme maximum temperatures and also higher minimum temperatures, and extreme precipitation and drought events. This means that precipitation events becoming more intense but separated by longer periods with the rainfall. And I think that the best example nowadays is the thing that's happening in Acapulco. But also, we are living in anthropogenic biomes. And these biomes is consequence of all the activities that the humans have been done. And in these anthropogenic biomes, there are obviously high density of humans. Also is the presence of the heat islands, and in one way, the increasing the temperature in the local scale. And also there are built-up areas, and the consequence is loss of the habitat. And this modifies, for example, the landscape in the urban areas. Fragmentation is another consequence of the activities of the humans, and drastically decreasing the connectivity between the patches of the vegetations that maybe there are in the urban areas. So all of these causes are negative impact on the biodiversity, and also they have greater effect on the global conservation. But as there are some suggestions to promote the conservation, one of these are action to biodiversity. One of these is this list. For example, is managing trees restoration, breeding, adding structure, a core line, promoting connection between patches or connection in the environment, data and publication, policies and governance and coordination and outreach. And in this talk, I will talk about one of our proposal is to promote the connection in the environmental to conservation of the species. So for this, I want to define what is the connectivity. And the environmental connectivity is the degree to which the landscape facilitates or impedes the movement of biota throughout their habitat, and patterns of high connectivity among population are associated. And this is the thing that I am very, very interested to understand the constant gene flow and increasing genetic diversity. But to reach this aim in our lab, first it's important to understand what is the connectivity in different landscapes. In this case, landscape is, for us, is the heterogeneous distribution of resources and conditions. But how we understand or how we evaluate the connectivity, environmental connectivity. So for this, we have to understand two things. One is that the composition, and when I would talk about composition, means how many patches we have in the landscape, what is the connection between patches, or what is the dominance inside of the patches. But also the other things that we can evaluate the connectivity is the configuration. And this configuration means how all these elements of the landscapes are distributed in one space. For example, where is the temperature in one space? This represents represents the space. And for example, in this space, how the temperature is distributed, how the precipitation is distributed, or where is the mountain are, where are the river, where the mountain, and if these all elements permit to move or the movement to the different organisms. And this represents how we evaluate, for example, if for this we do some resistance map. And in this resistance map, for example, means that in the green, there are the more resistance, and to arrive of this area with all these elements in the space, the cost for arrive to here is very high. So in this case, we can obtain some, for example, corridors to understand, and this corridor, I think that is important for conservation of the species. And why amphibian? Amphibian is one of the group most with a lot of richness. There is around 366 species of the amphibians, and we have for the 5th place in the world. In this map, we can see that in the dark, the green dark, there is the high richness of the amphibians. But if we pay focus in an endemic amphibian, because in Mexico there are a lot of endemic species, we will find that the richness is concentrated in the Trans-Mexican volcanic belt. But what happened in this area with the amphibians? Ochoa in 2011 evaluate in which area of the Mexico there is a species of amphibia that are in one risk category. And they found some the more species with a high category or are threatened is in the Trans-Mexican volcanic belt. But what are the causes of these risks in the amphibian? This map shows us what are the consequences. One of these is the overexploitation. The other one is the reduction of the habitat. And one of these that is in enigmatic explanation. But I think that this enigmatic explanation have relationship with the fungus that attack a different kind of natural population, and at least 491 species are at risk for this fungus. So amphibian are danger. In one previous study, we evaluate what will happen with the vertebrates in the present to the future on the climate change. And also we found in this area is the niche ecological for every group of the vertebrates. And we found that, for example, the amphibian is a purple ellipsoid, and we found that here, this red is the future, and this means that at least 50% of the idoneity of the conditions for the amphibians will be lost. For this reason, or for all these reasons, we have different questions because it's not necessary to understand where are the conditions. It's necessary to understand if these conditions are connected. So for this reason, our question is, will all special amphibians respond in the same way in the Trans-Mexican volcanic belt? Because also we believe that we can generalize the patterns, and we pay focus on every each species. The other question is environmental connectivity. We will say between species in the Trans-Mexican volcanic belt, and will environmental connectivity be the present, and it will be in the past the same? What will happen? First, our aim is evaluate and compare environmental connectivity amphibian species who live in the Trans-Mexican volcanic belt to obtain multi-species connectivity maps at the present, the future, and in the future, no at the moment, because we don't have all the results, to propose some ideas for conservation. For this, we took information about occurrence of the amphibian and the salamanders. At the end, we have 41 species. We clean all the information, and we obtain environmental variables. At the present, in two different scenarios, in one scenario where maybe don't happen a lot, but in another scenario where maybe happen a lot of things to for species. And after we do the connection between these niche ecological area. What we obtain. So first, we evaluate all the present niche ecological modeling, and we found that in red is the high suitability. This means that there are high conditions. And in blue is the low conditions. And we found that every species responds in different ways. But some species, for example, the salamandra, the area is very limited, and this is our focus for us, that is to start ask what is happening and to pay focus in this kind of species. But what will happen in the future? Maybe we believe that climate change will fatal for all the species, and this is true. For example, for this species, Dryophytes renicolors, maybe the climate change of this increasing, the increasing of the temperature, it will be fine for this species, and maybe in the future we will find more conditions for this species, and maybe the population will increase. But what will happen with Pseudorhizia robertsi, that is an endemic salamander of this area? The area we will reduce more than to the present, and maybe it will be lost. After we obtain this analysis, that means to compare every niche ecological of all these species, here I will show you all the important results. And one more time, Pseudorhizia tamontana, who are the salamander, we will reduce the area where it will be present. But in this next slide, I will show you how much area would the amphibian lose or gain. For example, here we put the 3 times, the present and the two times in the future on the climate change, and we start understand that the patterns are completely different for every species. And for example, in one of these, for example, lost area, and in this was lost area completely in the future, and some of them gain area for the future. This is our other families, and one more time, the most important and focus, or we require focus in the salamanders, because we believe that maybe salamanders will lose of the area where the conditions will are. But also, after we evaluate the connectivity at the present and the future to understand if these ecological conditions are connected, and we found that in spite of the area of the condition or the suitability is higher, the connection between this area is reducing. So the connectivity is not all the area, the connectivity is a small area. But what will happen in the future? Here in this map, we can see with details what is happened, but where are the cycles, the connection between these environmental condition we will lose in the future. And I think that this area are areas important for the conservation. For example, Ambystoma bicephalus, that is an amphibian that needs water reduce more than half the area that is connected between them. But in the future, for example, all this connection in this area, we will lose for these species. In conclusion, each of the amphibious species has different response to the climate change, and also connection area are different. Salamanders with increasing susceptibility to the climate change, so decreasing the fitness and loss the connectivity, maybe we have local extinction or virtual extinction. Amphibian endemic to the Trans-Mexican volcanic belt have a negative response to the change, and some of them are more susceptible, and species that have a distribution beyond to the Trans-Mexican volcanic belt maybe favor or remain stable. In conclusion, I think that we have to pay focus in every space and to understand what will happen to conservation. Thanks to different kinds of supports, this work is in collaboration with Carlos Luna and Marcos Suarez, and also with the students that working in our laboratory. Thanks.
Thank you so much for your presentation. There's been quite a few questions again in the chat, but I wondered if there was anyone in the audience or on the Zoom that would like to unmute to first ask a question.
If anyone wants to speak in Spanish, feel free to do it. We can change the settings for translation. Si alguien quiere hablar en español, siéntanse libre de hacerlo. Nosotros podemos hacer el ajuste para que pueda traducirse al inglés.
Might start with one question in the chat, which is from Gabriella. And the question is, have collaborations between researchers and the community been established for a continuous evaluation of amphibian populations? And in particular, are citizen science programs feasible for this?
Yes, inspired. I will use some information about this. What do you say? All of this data, but and I think that is very interesting to that a lot of people help us to obtain information because it's not enough our effort in the field job, for example.
We have one question here.
Please go ahead if there's a question from the audience. Is there a microphone in the audience for the questions there? Sorry, I'm just not sure if the audience of Zoom is hearing the question.
Yes.
Okay, again, congratulations for your presentation. It was really interesting. And my question is, at the population level of amphibians, we know that they have really limited dispersal patterns. They do not move many kilometers as other species of mammals or birds or any other vertebrates. Even if there is connectivity in the landscape, how does that gene flow can be, ¿cómo se puede llevar a cabo el flujo genético? Porque tienen una dispersión muy limitada, ¿no? Esa básicamente es la pregunta, ¿no? Aunque haya conectividad en el paisaje, ¿cómo y sobre todo en la faja volcánica, ¿no? Que el relieve es muy, la topografía es accidentada y, no sé, es interesante pensar en cómo podría mantenerse ese flujo génico, aunque sean vertebrados de una dispersión, bueno, de capacidades de dispersión limitada.
A good question. So for this, I think this is the first step to start understand the environment, but I think that the next step is to evaluate the gene flow because there is not a lot of words which evaluate the gene flow. And you have reason how to maintain, but I believe that in spite of, we believe that there are some like islands, maybe there are some spaces where are connected and we don't know where are. And maybe it's enough to gene flow for some species, but not for all. But also, I know, for example, in the salamanders in this area, Gabriela Parra evaluates the gene flow, historical gene flow, and they found that there are some isolation between different population along of these mountains. And some of them maybe could be our new species. So it depends. So it's for this reason I invite, it's important to say that we have to evaluate every species what will happen. But you have reason, the form conservation maybe will be very interesting and will be very difficult for these species.
Thank you very much. I think we are a little bit short of time for any more questions, but again, if you would like to get in contact with other panel members today or other speakers, Evelyn has shared that Google Sheets in the chat, so please feel free to include your contact details there so that we can maintain collaborations and continue conversations. Thank you very much again, Dr. Garrido, for your presentation. Thank you. For our final speaker today, before we move on to the roundtable discussion, is Dr. Amelia Wenger from the University of Queensland, and she will be presenting her research on cross-sectoral collaboration to tackle wastewater pollution. Amelia holds a joint position with the Wildlife Conservation Society as the lead of the One Water program, and with the University of Queensland as a senior research fellow. She has published over 40 publications in leading scientific journals, including Nature and Conservation Letters, and has received international recognition for her research. Passionate about integrated approaches to conservation, she is an academic partner of the Ocean Sewage Alliance and the lead PI of Improving Coastal Health Working Group through the Science for Nature and People Partnership. The SNAP program is developing decision guides for ocean-friendly sanitation that can meet both human and ecosystem health goals. So without further ado, over to you, Amelia. Thank you.
Hi, thank you all. Let me just get the screen sharing going. Okay. Everyone see that okay?
Yeah, that looks great. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. And I just want to congratulate Evelyn and the other organizers on this really innovative event. Today, I'll be speaking about cross-sectoral collaboration to tackle wastewater pollution, as Courtney said. And I wanted to talk about this work for a few reasons. One, I think, in the spirit of a conference about collaboration, just wanted to get some of the lessons learned about working cross-sectorally that I think, while talking about a particular context here, I think apply to other contexts as well. And secondly, Evelyn has been an instrumental part of all this work. And so I just wanted to showcase for all of you some of the amazing work that she has done. Okay. All right. First, to get everyone on the same page about what I'm talking about when I say wastewater pollution. So specifically, I'm speaking about pollution that comes from sort of domestic toilets, septic tanks, pit latrines, human waste. There's multiple ways that it can get into the environment. You can have it discharged directly from outfalls or through illegal dumping. You can have groundwater infiltration from pit latrines or septic tanks, and then you can have surface runoff that sort of captures overflowing pit latrines or open defecation practices. And that all runs off into the ocean. There is unfortunately a lot of wastewater pollution in oceans. Around 80% of the world's industrial and municipal domestic wastewater is discharged without treatment to surface waters, which equals about 300 to 400 million tons of pollution each year. 55% of coral reefs and 88% of seagrass meadows are exposed to wastewater pollution. And wastewater pollution has also been recorded in 104 out of the 108 coral reef country locations. Globally, there's also been 26 classes of pharmaceutical drugs have been recorded in the marine environment of 34 countries, and this is most likely an underestimation of the problem, especially because most conventional wastewater treatment does not currently remove pharmaceuticals from the waste. And unfortunately, all of this waste entering the coastal environments has major impacts onto our coastal ecosystems, such as mangroves, seagrass, and coral reefs. Pathogens present in wastewater can cause coral disease. Nutrient pollution negatively impacts coral growth, larval and adult coral survival, coral disease prevalence, bioerosion processes, and fertilization. Wastewater pollution has caused large-scale fish mortality events around the world. And wastewater pollution has also resulted in a significant loss of seagrass meadows globally. And finally, all these pharmaceuticals that are getting into our oceans and other water bodies significantly alter fish behavior at very low levels, and then have sort of sublethal and lethal effects as levels increase. There's also a lot of lines of evidence now to show that wastewater pollution negatively interacts with climate change to have worse outcomes for our coastal ecosystems. Wastewater pollution increases the prevalence and the severity of coral diseases and bleaching. wastewater pollution inhibits the recovery of coral reefs following bleaching events. Nutrient enrichment can make mangroves more vulnerable to erosion, while sea level rise and storm surges also increase erosion rates. Nutrient enrichment can also make mangroves more likely to die from climate-related drought. And marine heat waves amplify eutrophication and deoxygenation events caused by wastewater pollution, which can increase the severity of fish kills. And finally, nutrients from wastewater pollution reduce the ability of mangroves to store carbon, leading to increased emissions from these ecosystems and also undermining our blue carbon initiatives. And if that wasn't enough to sort of convince you of the challenges of wastewater pollution in the ocean, wastewater pollution also causes significant public health consequences for people who come in contact with it in marine environments. An estimated 180 million cases of upper respiratory disease and gastroenteritis occur each year as a result of bathing in polluted water or ingesting contaminated seafood. There's around 4 million cases and 40,000 deaths from infectious hepatitis A that occur annually from eating contaminated seafood. There's been dozens of outbreaks of norovirus linked to the consumption of contaminated bivalve mollusks, which can accumulate norovirus exposure to wastewater pollution. Norovirus globally causes an estimated 685 million cases of acute gastroenteritis and has an economic burden of $60 billion annually. Now, not all of that's from wastewater pollution, but just to point out sort of the significance of having norovirus cases increase. So overall, the public health consequences of wastewater pollution in coastal marine environments have resulted in sort of an estimated $19.8 billion US dollars annually in economic losses. And this is just a study that was done in 2021 that shows you the prevalence of wastewater pollution in the environment. So you can see the gradient from orange up to sort of the dark purple in terms of how much wastewater pollution is actually getting into the ocean. And it's been estimated that it's about 40% of the nitrogen that we get from agriculture pollution. So people often say agriculture is the big culprit of nutrient pollution in the marine environment. And actually, there's a significant amount of nitrogen that's deposited from wastewater pollution, both treated and untreated wastewater pollution every year. So why is this happening? Why is all this waste getting into the ocean? Just a very brief, quick primer on sanitation. So this is something that's called the sanitation ladder. And it starts from open defecation, which is the people who don't use toilets or any other facility and openly defecate in the ground, on water, in mangroves, up to safely managed sanitation. And that is where, you have access to a toilet. It's safely moved away and treated off-site. It's clean, and then there's a gradient in between. And I'd like to point out that even at safely managed sanitation, which is the sort of the goal that's been set by the sanitation community in the Sustainable Development Goals, still a definition of safely managed sanitation is discharging waste into the ocean. So that is still considered as safely managed, and discharging waste at treatment levels that still include a significant amount of nutrients going into the environment. And this is a map just showing you the share of the population from 2020, I think, with access to safely managed sanitation. You can see here there's a lot of countries that there's actually no data, and you can see the spread of people, have very limited access to safely managed sanitation up to places that have sort of higher levels of safely managed sanitation. And again, even in these places, if you go back, you can still see in the United States, for instance, where we have high levels of 100% access to safely managed sanitation, that still results in a huge amount of wastewater pollution ending up in the ocean. Okay, so this is a picture of me in the ocean. This is my happy place. I was trained as a coral reef ecologist. As most of my colleagues who work in coral reef conservation, we are most comfortable in the water. We trained to understand how coral reef ecosystems and coastal ecosystems work. I was not trained to understand what you do in situations like this, which is a common occurrence globally, where you have coastal communities that are living near the ocean, near sensitive ecosystems that have don't have access to safely managed sanitation. This really, even though wastewater pollution is such a significant impact to coastal environments, to actually address the problem, it's needed to really collaborate and understand how the sanitation world worked to begin to develop solutions on how to reduce impacts to oceans. So several of us applied for a Science and Nature and People Partnership Grant, which funds people to have working groups, bring working groups together, and funds a researcher to support the project, which is what Evelyn had done. And we wanted to come together to really figure out how can you collaborate together between conservation and sanitation to achieve both ecosystem health and human health goals. What does collaboration even look like? What are the challenges? And I guess very quickly realized, I think, that, and I think this is probably common in other development sectors, is that sanitation has huge and significant problems achieving their goals. There's a shortage of technical capacity to actually implement and maintain infrastructure. There's a lack of political will, insufficient policies, and lack of enforcement and compliance to even get them to safely managed sanitation, limited financial resources, imbalance in resource allocation. Sanitation is also considered sort of the poor cousin of water, the water community that gets a lot of funding and attention. There's a huge technology gap in sanitation infrastructure. So even when you look at situations where you're next to a coast and you say we need better toilets, that might not exist yet. And there's also environmental challenges that make implementing sanitation solutions really complicated. And so the message that we kept hearing from sanitation was that they are having a hard time meeting even their own goals that they've set. And when you're working in contexts like this, where there's significant human health consequences from people living in crowded environments with sort of no access to toilets, really, it's hard to really then think about, well, where does that water then go? Because even though I can point to statistics about impacts to oceans, there's this sort of immediate concern in place around trying to deliver options to people, sanitation systems to people that are experiencing sort of significant human health impacts in place. So I guess this was our cross-sectoral collaboration lesson number one, which is the need to shift the paradigm. So we had to kind of move from this, it's almost what was being perceived as a blame of we need you to do better so that we can solve our coastal pollution problem, towards how can we support you to achieve your own goal. And so really I had to think about, well, what can marine conservation bring to the table that's different to actually be able to support sanitation and achieving their goals. And again, I think this, even though this is specific to sanitation and conservation, I think that this would be applied probably, these lessons would apply as conservation is collaborating with other sort of development sectors about, well, what can we bring to the table to help us achieve shared goals. So we sort of said, you can achieve these multiple shared goals encompassing the environment, society, and the economy that we've signed up with for the Sustainable Development Goals, for the Global Biodiversity Framework, for the Paris Climate Agreement. We can bring new voices to the table. So conservation can be a bridge to the tourism sector, the fisheries sector, who might have a lot of, in areas where you have a really big tourism sector, you might have a lot of sway and be able to gain political will that way through new voices. You could have more strategic resource allocation through partnering together and access to a broader suite of funding sources. So if you can link the impacts of sanitation to oceans, can you then access conservation funding to then be able to address sanitation challenges? And similarly to this, then that can help conservation drive investment into sanitation programs. And ultimately enhance the resilience of coastal communities to climate change. As I mentioned, when wastewater pollution impacts coastal ecosystems, that also makes communities who are living there more vulnerable to climate change and also puts their sanitation systems at risk. I guess the second really big question that we had to ask ourselves was, if the sanitation sector achieves their goals, will the marine conservation sector's goals be achieved as well? Was it just a case of supporting sanitation to achieve their goals, or did something different have to happen? And after a lot of debate and discussion around this, what we realized is actually, yes, we had to work in an integrated and collaborative way, because if sanitation just went about their business and we just supported through funding or through increasing political will, it still was not going to be enough to achieve conservation's goals. And so as part of this working group, we then put together this guide for integrated conservation and sanitation programs and approaches, which sort of goes through ways in which sanitation and conservation can collaborate across lots of different scales to achieve our shared goals. So for instance, we worked through in an integrated approach who were the stakeholders that needed to be involved and how this looked different. So you can see here under local coastal communities, you needed people who were both dependent on coastal ecosystems for food and livelihood security, as well as people who were concerned about sanitation only. You needed in industry, you needed commercial fishers, tourism, private sector development to come to the table. NGOs, you need people from the water and sanitation community, but also conservation development sectors. So really thinking through about having all stakeholders at the table together from the start, so that we're working together in collaboration. We also developed tools about, when should the sanitation community really need to think about wastewater pollution challenges in the ocean. So we developed a risk screening tool that worked through different aspects of the sanitation system and then characteristics of the watershed that might make pollution more likely to arrive to the coast, as well as working on things like where there are a lot of wind and waves and currents that might disperse pollution really rapidly in the ocean, so you weren't having as big of an impact, and where there ecosystems of concern or tourism or marine protected areas that could potentially be vulnerable. And finally, this was really was Evelyn's brainchild, was thinking through this diagnostic about how at the policy and governance level, how do you really think about integrating approaches? And so worked through a decision tree about, depending on whether or not you had a mechanism to coordinate and actions that people could take at the policy level to really start bridging the gaps at that, to create the political will and the know-how within political systems to actually work in an integrated way. And I guess our second really big lesson of cross-sectoral collaboration is that it's hard and you'll make mistakes. This project has really required me to dig deep on an entirely new field that I didn't understand, I didn't have any training in, and inevitably I got things wrong about it. That process of learning, of supporting each other, recommitting was so important. And a lot of the discussions that we had were so important around sort of the practice of cross-sectoral collaboration that we also then came up with these sort of ways of working. So we talked about establishing this collective vision. It's not working to say we're going to meet sanitation's goals or ocean's goals. It's going to be we're going to work together to achieve these shared goals. How do we coordinate and cooperate? How are we inclusive to make sure that we're bringing all of the stakeholders to the table? Operating with integrity to make sure that we are representing our fields well, and also respecting the other field. Acknowledge that there's uncertainty in a lot of these things, and you have to sort of move forward together. Using shared languages and terms, it seems so simple, but a lot of our initial discussions as part of the working group were around, what are the terms that we want to use? What are the terms that are not too technical, but still are correct in terms of conveying what we mean them to be? And really, I think that this point about ensuring mutual respect and equity. I came to the table as an expert in coral reef science, knew very little about sanitation, and the sanitation community came to the table as expert in sanitation and knew very little about conservation. And so it's how do we sort of respect each other's expertise and also the process of learning and growing and making mistakes together. So our main conclusions or takeaway messages from all of this work was that cross-sector collaboration is hard but necessary. There needs to be more opportunities for dialogue between sectors, and also, as this conference emphasizes, dialogues across sort of the conservation sector, working in very different environments. Reducing wastewater pollution also became very clear that it needs to be at the forefront of climate resilient strategies for coastal marine ecosystems and also coastal communities. A lot of countries don't lack the policy framework for coordinating mechanisms. And again, this transcends beyond just conservation and sanitation. To work on any kind of integrated approach, you need the ability to sort of coordinate the work. There were significant data gaps still that hinder our ability to effectively manage wastewater pollution. And as I said, with this acknowledging the uncertainty and how do we move forward, knowing that there's an issue, but in a sort of data limited space. And also, with a lot of this work, even coming up with finance mechanisms to then finance this work, we're dealing with this now. Our Coral Reef Funder is funding work in sanitation, and the learning together sort of and teaching the funder about what it means to monitor and evaluate sanitation, which is very different from conservation. So I will leave you there. I'll put a link to the document that we launched in the chat for those who are interested. And I welcome any questions. And also just like a big thank you to all of I made these slides last night, so I didn't get to have a thank you slide, but to all of the people who were involved with this working group.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Amelia. There's also been a few questions in the chat. So I'll read one of those first, and then if there's more in the audience, please feel free to unmic and take advantage of our live translation service if you like. So one of the first questions, Amelia, that came up is if there was an example of successful collaboration between different sectors involving government, industry, and the community to mitigate wastewater pollution. And if there is, how those lessons maybe could be applied elsewhere.
Yeah, great question. There are a few really good examples. There's one example in particular from Roatan and Honduras. And there we've outlined sort of in 3 parts in the document, sort of all the lessons learned and how that went. But basically, I think the main lessons are it takes longer. The expectations about project time scales, that you need to sort of say, this is going to take twice as long because it takes a long time to get everyone on the same page and to work through these challenges of integrating. But that is a really great example of international funding, communities, conservation NGO driving change. And there's a few other examples in there as well of a project that was done, maybe not on oceans, but conservation and water and sanitation in South Africa as well. And I think a lot of those lessons are really applicable to other contexts. And we sort of go through a lot of the challenges people have faced in this as well.
Jonathan, is your hand up there?
Is that me?
Yeah, Jonathan,
yeah. I'll try and turn on my video as well. Hi, thanks, Amelia. Presumably there must be big win-wins both for livelihoods, the economy, and the environment from sanitation, improved sanitation. So what are the major barriers that prevent improved sanitation happening? I mean, is it just resource or financially constrained? Is it political? Some other resource constraint? I don't know. Or is it different from every case is different and the constraints are different?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's obviously going to be things that are very context dependent. There's huge issues in terms of sort of system delivery. So in a lot of places that don't have sewage systems, you have to get waste from a septic tank to a pit latrine to another location where it gets treated. And it's sort of who pays for that, creates that. There's a lot of challenges with service delivery. And then, so then there's a finance question, there's a political will question. And oftentimes you find, people who are countries where people have really poor access to sanitation are also really marginalized. So it's harder to garner the political will to sort of, implement change, which is why, as a thinking about, well, what can we bring to the table is sort of like, well, in areas where you have tourism, that might be a really big advocate in places where you might not have a strong voice for change.
And one final question as well is, I wondered with the approach that you've taken and by sort of leveraging these other issues such as food security in terms of fisheries and sanitation, if you've ended up with unexpected partners along the way, and if you have, who they might be. that you've ended up having conversations with or collaborating with that you just sort of never expected would be part of the discussion or solution?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I've spent a lot of the last 3 years having conversations with various people from the sanitation sector, and I think similar, you'd say, oh, I work in conservation. We just had to talk about amphibians in Mexico and, wastewater pollution in coral reef. So, we have these huge gaps in our own field, and sanitation is no different. So I found that in general, the people who have been sort of most receptive or more interested in this are really people who are thinking not necessarily at the sort of, I guess, the engineering part of like, how do we design a system to deliver things, but really at that systems level. So, really interesting partners from UNEP, United Nations Environment Program, really interesting partnerships from UNICEF as well, because they're really interested in this, because they're thinking not just at that the sanitation delivery, but also thinking around childhood health and UNICEF works across a broad range of things. So they do think about malnutrition as well. And a lot of interest from entrepreneurs and sanitation companies who are looking about how to do things in an innovative and different way.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you again, Amelia, for your presentation. That concludes our sessions or our speaking sessions for today. But before we end the conference for today, we're going to have a roundtable discussion with Professor Jonathan Rhodes, who is one of our speakers for tomorrow. And I'd like to invite all of the speakers from today's session to please join the panel as well, if they like, and Dr. Daniel Dunn as well from the University of Queensland. The focus of the roundtable discussion today is really to have a collaborative discussion and to focus on the challenges, the successes, and the opportunities for conservation that we see in Australia, Mexico, and more broadly. I'd like to invite the audience to continue submitting their fabulous questions through the chat or also through video if they wish. And yeah, as I mentioned, our live translation service is available. So please feel free to ask your questions in Spanish or English or whichever way you feel the most comfortable. To start, I'd like to ask the panel to please share their perspectives on the main challenges to conserving biodiversity and how collaboration can perhaps be leveraged to address some of these, the challenges that we're facing.
I can jump in if you want. Oh, Amelia. First, gracias otra vez para la oportunidad de hablar con todos. Es un placer y espero que we'll continue this process in the future. With that, I just want to say my work is largely in areas beyond national jurisdiction. And in areas beyond national jurisdiction, it's all collaboration, right? We have no option. There is no single country, there is no single entity that can sort of make things happen and implement conservation. And there's been a big opportunity with a new treaty that's just been signed and not ratified yet by enough countries, the Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdiction Treaty. But even that is not a single entity that can implement conservation actions across this 70% of the globe. It requires collaboration. It requires engaging across countries and coming together, Mexico, Australia, Pacific Rim countries to talk about what to do in that shared portion of the world, and how we can work together to decide on which areas to conserve. And we've seen this repeatedly. Antarctica is a really good example of this, that it's not going to work unless everybody's at the table. And even these days, things don't move without Russia being at the table and agreeing to things. So I think it's just part parcel of what we have to do when we're talking about marine conservation. But hand off there to more terrestrial perspectives.
I wouldn't say I'm terrestrial perspective, but I guess closer to the coast. I guess in the context of creating this document, so not even considering collaborating with a different sector, but I think when you're trying to to make the sum of your work greater than the parts, and think about, what are lessons that can apply more broadly. If I had written this document from the perspective of someone who thought about, pollution in Australia, then it would have had really limited relevance to lots of parts of the world. So I needed to sort of sit there and understand the challenges in Hawaii, in Fiji, in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in Kenya, in Honduras, where people had overcome these things, where were the sticking points, to understand both, what are the sort of unexpected challenges that you might not understand if you're just thinking about your perspective, but also, what are the different opportunities for learning and sharing lessons that, as people have confronted challenges.
And I'll just add to that, I'm thinking about sort of cross-sectoral collaboration. I think it's interesting the talks we've seen this morning, people talking about protection versus restoration, and I guess we have these different sectors focusing on these aspects of protection, and then other sectors focusing on things like restoration. And I guess that I think of sanitation as restoration, really. And so, and I think we sort of have these opposing, threats, I suppose, to biodiversity and solutions. And I think we just need more. And I don't think they talk to each other enough. So when we're making decisions about protection, we should also be thinking about the other side, which is restoration and threats, and what we might lose as a result, and the challenges of actually putting stuff back in the future. If you've polluted waterways, how do we put it back, and the difficulty of doing that? And I think these are often siloed to some extent, and I think we need to work much more closely together. But also, I agree with Daniel, across geographic boundaries as well.
Thank you. As I suppose a follow-up question to that, I wondered if our panel speakers and our speakers today as well from Mexico might be able to share some examples of where conservation has been applied successfully, perhaps at a local context or more broadly, and where it's been applied successfully, perhaps through policy or regulation or just on-ground works. I know there was some discussion about that around restoration activities. So if you could share some good news stories, that would be fantastic.
I had this very question several years ago, and I decided to look into it to understand sort of what we had done, and 7 years later, and have grown 2 entire humans in that time, I finally have finished collating this massive database, and we've done amazing things globally. So I looked at all of the threats in coastal and marine environments, and that when we had successfully implemented a management solution that gave out good outcomes. And so, for instance, we've restored 93 million hectares of the ocean against pollution and seen a recovery. We've recovered. The amount of protected areas is massive. There's been really amazing work that's been done on reducing ship strikes against whales through, partnership, really important partnerships across both national and sort of interstate lines. So yeah, there are, and I think sometimes in conservation, we can get very focused on the negative things. But for me anyways, building that database was really important. He is motivated to be like, actually, that when we do things well and when we work well together, we can achieve really great things. But it does, the lesson from that was it requires collaboration and coordination. You can't do these things and achieve these really big wins on your own.
And I think the collaboration is really critical to do these things at scale. I think there are good examples of success, but to do them at scale, we have to work together.
Yeah. I would like to say from Mexico that probably some of the talks that we already have yesterday, as for example, with the laws to protect axolotl, and also the work that we see from systematic planning today, usually translates in some political laws and government, but we're still lacking the actual result, because many of the things in Mexico stays in paper. I'm not sure if that happens also in Australia, but we work a lot. We try to translate to decision makers and stakeholders, but still we are like biased as scientists to just produce the data and not necessarily do the follow-up to see how the implementation goes. And at least in Mexico, it's really hard because there's like a lot of resistance from different areas like industry or even in the government. So in different secretaries, they have like a way to work, as for example, like putting some salmon trouts or some other things in the river, despite the fact that we said that this will be terrible for the environment. So I think we have like good news, like a lot of things that we have achieved, but still there's a huge gap between information generating and implementation.
I think that was just one massive unanimous nod in agreement from across the globe. Yeah, I from a restoration perspective, and I'm very local in my focus. I'm not an international person of mystery like my fellow panel members here. But you know, collaborating with people who actually undertake restoration in Australia, the people that do the work. As a researcher, it surprised me how little scientific information is actually used by restoration practitioners. A lot of information is shared through experience in Australia and through networks of other experts. And some of that information isn't always particularly rational. But that doesn't seem to matter. You know, there's a big focus on experience. And so, yeah, I've been really surprised at how the data that I produce, which I think is, of course, very important, is either already known, they knew that already 30 years ago, you wasted your time, John, or it's not perceived as important. So there's even just among people who you would think are on the same page, they're not, and that affects implementation greatly.
Yeah, maybe I'll say a couple of words. I work a lot on trade-offs, and I'm interested in trade-offs because I'm interested in policy and how people make decisions. And I think one thing I've learned throughout my career is that people make decisions and policy makers make decisions for lots of reasons that have nothing to do with information, scientific information. And so I think it's trying to understand what the policy or decision maker objectives are and why are they making the decisions they are. What are the other things they care about? And if you understand that, I think then you can start to identify potential avenues which you could influence them. But I think we have to recognize that they make decisions for lots of other reasons that are not anything to do with scientific information.
I think that's such an important point, Jonathan. And I think that sometimes is maybe our failings as a conservation community or as environmentalists. We go, if we just give people the information to say how bad things are for biodiversity, they're going to make decisions. And I mean, I think that for me, the huge lesson in trying to get sanitation like on board with thinking about the environment was like meeting them where they were. Like they were not, yeah, they were like, yeah, okay, the environment, I can see that. That was not going to ever be something that was going to motivate change. So it was this sort of like for policymakers or for communities, it's like and let me meet you where you are and be strategic about sort of influencing, you know, getting good conservation outcomes. But, you know, sort of learned that I couldn't just sort of show my first slide and like, see, it's bad for the ocean. So please, like, that should be enough for you. Like, yeah.
I've just noticed that we have a question from the audience as well. So is that Dr. Maria Mendy?
How are you? I'm from Mexico, from the first Iztacala, and I want to make a comment on this in the same way as Ibrahim. I think we have done a lot of things in Mexico and you in Australia and everywhere trying to get together all the information about what is needed for conservation, the natural history, the environmental conditions, whatever we have been searching. But and I have worked also with many organizations, international organizations, to try to raise the voice, for example, for the conservation of pollinators in North America, and also with IPEBES at the global world, no? And we gather all the information regarding what is needed, what you should not do with the pesticides and whatever you need with the pollinators. We publish that even in the best journals you can imagine. And then when we get to the point to get that thing to the government, that's the very difficult point. No, we have even combined the governmental people in Mexico to put together a strategy for conservation of pollinators. That was very hard, but they did, and they even write a manuscript and a book on the strategy for conservation of Mexican pollinators. But to put that book, that strategy, that is only words, no, in the book, into action, into conservation practice, is the difficult thing. What to do next? We have the strategy. We have to do this and then this and this, but do it, no? We know that, and how you say do it, no, to the governmental people. I think that's the difficult point for in Mexico, at least.
Okay, so I realize that we've almost finished time today, but I think that comment sort of brings us to a nice concluding point. We obviously share a lot of the same passions, a lot of the same interests, and a lot of the same challenges as well. So before we finish, I'd like to just ask one final question to our panel members and our speakers today, which is what strengths and tools do you think that we have from our respective universities that we can use to undertake research and perhaps build collaboration together?
I was gonna say diversity and perspectives, I think is critical. So, you know, if we can bring those together, that would be great.
Okay, hi. I will say that probably for collaboration, we will start making some lists of research interests in order of start making agreements on collaboration, and start with the matchmaking, because I think a lot of our students here on the room are really keen to start working with people abroad. And at least my perspective is that we could start doing with this general agreement, but not just making it in words, not making it in paper. We need to put it on action. So if we start working in these ideas, common ideas with different researchers from Australia and Mexico, we may start working on a strategy to actually make our students go there, or even our researchers go there, and maybe you came here and use these tools that we have now, like this Zoom chat or conference, just in order to start making this matchmaking, to strengthen our bonds, and later on work on probably the real agreement. Because as I said yesterday, the University of Queensland and UNAM have a starting point with an agreement, but it just never get validated. So perhaps now the way we may start working backwards and making it work, and then start working in the paper and all the legal stuff.
Yeah, I think just to follow on, those sentiments are excellent, and I agree with them. And I think we have a couple of different levels here. We have some, you know, on a center level, I think there's a lot that we can do to encourage and incentivize collaboration and small projects between the universities. But I think we can also definitely take your historical knowledge of previous attempts at trying to get UNAM and UQ together and definitely run that up the ladder at the Faculty of Science here and try to get them to move on that. So I'd be happy to do that on our end. Thank you for reminding us of it.
I might say just as the final point, like, but as Jonathan said, diversity of perspectives, but also diversity of backgrounds and life experience, and the partnerships that we've made along the way and that we bring together to the system. Like this conference is a great example because Evelyn was here at the University of Queensland and had these amazing connections. And so it's through, that we've been able to make these. And I think that is, I was speaking from a UQ perspective, I think that's a huge strength, is the people that we are able to bring to the table.
Thank you very much, everybody. So we have come to the end of our session today. So I'd like to take this opportunity again to thank all of our fabulous presenters and panel members. And of course, also to thank the organizers, Evelyn and Harris, for coordinating this really wonderful opportunity for us to be able to exchange experiences and learn and collaborate. As we've mentioned before, there is that contact detail sheet if you would like to include your details so that we can facilitate further collaborations. Feel free to add your details. I've been told that there is a slight change in the schedule for tomorrow's session. So tomorrow's session will start at the same time as today, which is 8 a.m. Australian Daylight or Australian Eastern Time, and 4 p.m. In Mexico. And the change to this schedule is just a slight rearrangement of the speakers. But before we go, I'd like to just pass over to Evelyn because I think she has some final words to say as well. And thank you again, everyone, for your fantastic discussion and fantastic questions.
Thank you so much. Trigger future collaborations between our institutions. And I also want to thank CBCS and all the senior researchers, especially Dr. Daniel Dunn, Dr. Tetsuya Mano, and Dr. Alice Twomey for giving the opportunity to support to early career researchers like Harris and me to run this kind of projects. And also I want to thank you to the Minister Marta Peña Jaramillo for their support on behalf of the Embassy of Mexico and Australia. And finally, I would like to ask you to turn on your camera if you feel like to take a group photo, just to close this event today. So hold your smile, please. Another shot. One more. That's it. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time, and see you tomorrow for our last session. Have a good one. Buenas tardes en México. Hasta luego.